Perfect. And should I begin my presentation?
Sean, let me make the introduction and
Sure.
outline
Perfect.
the process for us. Yeah.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask you, how do I pronounce your last name correctly?
Oh, sure. It's Blankenship.
Blankenship. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Okay. So I would like to introduce Sean Blankenship, who will be our MBA thesis candidate presentation. TRU for the MBA program. Uh, can you just give us the title of your thesis again?
Sure. It's First Nation government investing policy and community well-being.
Great, great. So this is a very interesting topic, and I am impressed by uh, the extensive work that you've done, and I really appreciate the involvement of the your supervisors. I believe that was Randy and who were this? Laura Hasnat?
Uh,
Yeah,
yes.
great. And we'd like to welcome Dr. Joe Zhang from the University of Regina as our external examiner. And okay, it's a small world. Great to see familiar faces again. And it was a great surprise. So in the process, then we will have Sean present your thesis, and then afterwards we will have a question period from the examining committee. Okay. Um, so that will include our external examiner, the supervisory committee members, and the supervisor. So we will have more than one round of questions. Okay. All right. So without further word, let's begin. Sean, you can start your presentation for us. Look forward to it.
Great. Great. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for that introduction. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. And everyone can see my presentation screen there properly. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Blankenship, and I'm an MBA student at Thompson Rivers University. This presentation is of my thesis defense and is on the topic First Nation Government Investing Policy and Community Well-Being. This presentation will review the introduction, literature review, methodologies and hypotheses, results and discussion, and conclusion. The research topic is what relationship exists between First Nation government investing policies and community well-being, and do geographic remoteness and population levels influence this relationship? And the research objectives are twofold. First is to provide greater insight into the relationship between First Nation community well-being and First Nation government investing policies, and second, to evaluate how geographic remoteness and population levels influence this relationship. So what is the significance of this research? We want to better understand the relationship between investing policy and community well-being of First Nation communities in Canada, and these insights will assist community leaders and policymakers in developing sound investing policy for First Nation governments. And in our literature review, we will consider two key areas. First is First Nation community well-being studies, and second is First Nation government investing policies. First, let us consider community well-being. Lassane and Lamb utilized regression analysis when analyzing the impact of social capital on Aboriginal employment income. This study provides evidence for a causal link indicating that good health and social capital positively impact employment income of Canada's Aboriginal population. And through case studies, Cantatol identified the importance of social ties, cultural attachment, and connection with traditional land as important factors in Indigenous well-being. And in a 2019 study, Sain and Lamb found statistically significant relationships between economic security and Indigenous psychological well-being for Canada's Indigenous population. Now let's consider First Nation government investing policies. Vining and Richards evaluate the relationship between own source income and the Community Wellbeing Index and find a modest, positive, and statistically significant correlation. Flatworthy discusses how a large portion of on-reserve First Nation housing is collectively owned, often by the First Nation government, and typically does not reflect a free real estate market. And the study finds that 36% of on-reserve housing was in need of major repairs, and this was based off of 2001 data. And Redon et al. Discuss how First Nation governments can use trust funds to smooth the proceeds of impact benefit agreements over time and across multiple generations. Now let's move on to the methodologies and hypotheses of this study. We will consider the definitions used in this study, as well as the population definition. We will evaluate 2 key data sources, as well as 3 statistical methodologies used. For the definitions, geographic remoteness classifications are based on geographic zones as defined by Indigenous Services Canada. And when we look at financial indicators, these include both accounting ratios and per capita measures, which are derived from First Nation government financial statements, as well as the community population as per the census. Also, statistical significance is assessed at the 5% level throughout the study. And the study defines the population as First Nation communities in Canada that maintain a distinct land-based territory with at least 50 people. 583 First Nations meet this population definition, and of these, 446 First Nations have usable demographic and financial data. So as such, 446 nations are evaluated throughout this study. Now let's look at our data sources. Our first key data source is the 2016 First Nation Government Audited Financial Statements. And these financial statements are prepared by each First Nation and are available on the Indigenous Services Canada website. And from this financial data, we derive the financial indicators. And note that these financial indicators are quantifiable measures of underlying investing policies. And our second key data source is the 2016 Census of First Nation Communities. And of course, the census was conducted by Statistics Canada. So the key census data sources used are education levels, personal income levels, employment and participation rates, the state of residential housing, and knowledge of Indigenous language. Note that our demographic indices are derived from these data sources. And then we take an adjusted average of these indices to create a composite nation wellness index. And this study uses 3 statistical methodologies. First is descriptive statistics. These are calculated for each financial indicator and demographic index. And we look at items such as the mean, median, standard deviation, and range. The second methodology is Pearson correlation analysis. A Pearson correlation coefficient is calculated between each financial indicator and each demographic index, as well as between each of the demographic indices. And the expected correlation for each instance is hypothesized based on the existing research. And note that each of these correlations are expected to be positive. And the third methodology is multiple linear regression. This analysis is conducted with each demographic index as the dependent variable. And we see these dependent variables on the left, and on the right we see the full regression model. And note that there are 9 independent variables, and these independent variables are the same for each individual regression. And here is a table of these independent variables, and we can see a detailed description of the variable on the right. And there are 6 financial variables, one community population level variable, and 2 geographic remoteness variables. And note that the geographic variables are categorical. In summary, we used two key data sources in the study. First are the 2016 First Nation Government audited financial statements, from which we derive our financial indicators. And second, the 2016 census of First Nation communities, from which we derive our demographic indices. And we use three statistical methodologies. We have descriptive statistics, Pearson correlation analysis, and multiple linear regression. Now let's move on to the results and discussion of the study. Multiple linear regression is the most rigorous method and will be emphasized in this presentation. First, we will look at the multiple linear regression results, and then we will get into a discussion of community well-being, investing policy, financial indicators, and population level and geographic remoteness. So here are the multiple linear regression results, and we see that there are numerous statistically significant marginal effects here, and many very interesting patterns. And these will be evaluated in detail in the I think my share screen just stopped. I'll just try sharing my screen again. Okay, I think it's working. Sorry about the disruption there. I'll just continue. So we see there are numerous statistically significant marginal effects here and many very interesting patterns. And these will be evaluated in detail in the upcoming discussion. Okay, so first we will look at community well-being. So each demographic index is reviewed and key marginal effect figures are evaluated based on the linear regression results that we saw on the previous slide. So let's start with the education index. The education index increases by 1.72 for 0.1 increase in the earned and other revenue ratio, and the index increases by 0.40 per $1,000 increase in First Nation source transfer revenue per capita. And there is no statistically significant relationship when this transfer revenue is directly from the federal or provincial governments. As well, the index decreases slightly when the community population level increases. And when we consider the geographic remoteness variables, and note that these are differential variables compared to geographically close communities, so the education index is lower by 4.76 for geographically medium communities, and the education index is lower by 16.89 for geographically remote communities. So we can see that greater geographic remoteness is associated with quite a lower education level. And now let's look at the language index. This index maintains distinct and often converse relationships compared to the other indices. The language index decreases by 2.29 per 0.1 increase in the earned and other revenue ratio. The index increases, by 0.78 for every 100% increase in community population. And when we look at geographic remoteness, the language index is higher by 9.26 for geographically medium communities, and the language index is higher by 30.62 for geographically remote communities. So we see here that greater geographic remoteness is associated with a much higher level of Indigenous language knowledge. And just another note, you'll see that the direction of each of these marginal effects is opposite to what we saw for the education index. And now let's look at the housing index. This index increases by 1.72 for 0.1 increase in the earned and other revenue ratio, and a positive correlation exists between the housing index and most business activity indicators, and this is as per the Pearson correlation analysis. And looking at geographic remoteness, the housing index is lower by 6.17 for geographically medium communities, and the housing index is lower by 15.81 for geographically remote communities. So we see here that greater geographic remoteness is associated with significantly lower levels of housing conditions. And looking at the workforce index, this index increases by 0.83 for 0.1 increase in the earned and other revenue ratio. And looking at the marginal effect of transfer revenue, we see that this index increases by 0.15 for each $1,000 increase in federal and provincial government transfer revenue per capita. And this index increases by 0.37 for each $1,000 increase in First Nation source transfer revenue. So we see a trend here. There is a greater and a more positive marginal effect per dollar transferred when the transfer revenue is from a First Nation source. And finally, the workforce index decreases slightly when the community population level increases. And now looking at the income index, interestingly, no statistically significant relationship exists with the earned and other revenue ratio. And this index decreases by 0.19 for each $1,000 increase in federal and provincial government transfer revenue per capita. And note that there is no statistically significant relationship when the transfer revenue is from a First Nation source. And now let's look at the Nation Wellness Index. And recall that this is an adjusted average of the previous indices. So the Nation Wellness Index increases by 0.77 for 0.1 increase in the earned and other revenue ratio. And when we look at the marginal effect of transfer revenue, the index increases by 0.35 for $1,000 increase in First Nation source transfer revenue per capita. And there is no statistically significant relationship with transfers from the federal and provincial government. So the trend continues that we generally see a more positive marginal effect per dollar transferred when the transfer revenue is from a First Nation source. Now we look at business, earned, and other revenue activities. The earned and other revenue ratio maintains a positive marginal effect on the education, workforce, housing, and Nation Wellness indices. And it maintains a negative marginal effect on the language index. And most business activity indicators maintain positive correlations with these indices, except for the language index, and this is as per the Pearson correlation analysis. Now let's look at trust fund activities. The trust fund asset ratio maintains negative marginal effects on the education, housing, and Nation Wellness indices. And when we look at nations with a high level of trust assets, negative correlations are found between the trust fund asset ratio and the workforce and housing indices. And this is as per a stratified correlation analysis. Now looking at tangible capital asset activities, the tangible capital asset ratio maintains negative marginal effects on all of the demographic indices except for the language index. Note that this may be more of a function of having fewer other assets instead of necessarily having more tangible capital assets. And this would be an interesting area to investigate further. And now let's consider the impact of population level. A 100-person increase in population level has the following marginal effects. The education index decreases by 0.19, the workforce index decreases by 0.36, and the language index increases by 0.78. Also, increases in population maintain a negative relationship with cumulative tangible capital assets per capita, as well as a negative relationship with revenue per capita. And this is from almost every revenue source. And now let's consider the impact of geographic remoteness. Greater geographic remoteness is associated with higher federal and provincial transfer revenue per capita, lower levels of education, lower conditions of residential housing, and higher knowledge of Indigenous language knowledge. So in summary, we've reviewed the multiple linear regression results. We've had a discussion on community well-being, investing policy financial indicators, and population level and geographic remoteness. As we move to our conclusion, it's important to review our research objectives. So the research objectives are twofold. First is to provide greater insight into the relationship between First Nation community well-being and First Nation government investing policies, and second, to better understand the impact of population level and geographic remoteness on this relationship. The discussion has highlighted several new insights to make informed policy decisions for First Nation leaders and policymakers. So let's review some of these highlights. Earned and other revenue maintain positive and statistically significant correlations with most community well-being measures. Note that earned revenue can often be associated with nation-owned businesses and economic development activities. And a greater marginal effect is present for transfer revenue from First Nation-controlled entities compared to direct transfers from the federal and provincial governments. Also, greater geographic remoteness has a strong association with lower education levels and lower housing additions. Remoteness is also associated with higher levels of Indigenous language knowledge. Finally, higher levels of trust fund asset ratio and tangible capital asset ratios are associated with lower levels of most community well-being measures. And we have a number of areas for future research. First is to conduct an investigative study to evaluate why geographically remote communities maintain lower education levels, lower housing additions, and higher knowledge of Indigenous language knowledge. Second is to evaluate why negative correlations exist between trust fund asset ratio and the workforce and housing indices, and this is especially for First Nations with high levels of trust assets. And third is to evaluate why negative correlations exist between the tangible capital asset ratio and the education, workforce, housing, and income indices. And this could be done by conducting a correlational analysis with tangible capital asset categories. And this would likely provide some very insightful results. And in conclusion, the study evaluates data from the year 2016. This provides a framework for understanding the realities of First Nation communities, but does not decide the realities for First Nations going forward. New insights from the study enable First Nation leaders to better understand the relationships between investing policies and community well-being. And finally, these new insights can inform visionary Indigenous leaders as they shape a path for First Nations people into the future. And this brings this presentation to a close. I have a couple slides of references. And at the direction of our chair, I am now open for questions.